On March 25, 2022, 87 people were killed in El Salvador in response to the government's seizure of 2 bus routes in the capital, which gangs extorted for revenue. The perpetrators were members of MS-13, the ruthless gang operating in the country and beyond. However, during the reign of this gang, President Nayib Bukele and his government decisively dismantled it, forever changing the nation's history. In February 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero wrote an open letter to U.S. President Jimmy Carter, urging him to stop military aid to the Salvadoran regime. Romero stated that the U.S. was aiding those who oppressed their people. At that time, the Spanish controlled resources and ruled with an iron fist. Romero sought peace, but was assassinated 3 weeks later. The peace that Romero desired was achieved almost 40 years later under the government of Nayib Bukele and his violence reduction policies, but those decades were marked by struggles, conflicts, and deaths. On March 31, 1980, 250,000 Salvadorans attended Romero's funeral, but government shooters attacked the crowd, killing 42 people and injuring over 200. It was a massacre, and Salvadorans would face even worse tragedies. On December 2, 1980, 4 American missionaries were kidnapped by 5 guards in El Salvador. They were taken to a remote location where they suffered violence, rape, and death. Their bodies were found the next morning, sparking local and global outrage. In response, U.S. President Jimmy Carter temporarily cut off aid to El Salvador, allowing a civilian group to form the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. This group retaliated against every attack by the Salvadoran military. When the FMLN was close to regaining control of the country, a change occurred with the election of a new U.S. president, Ronald Reagan. The Reagan administration supported the Salvadoran armed forces, increasing financial aid by $10 million, including $5 million in weapons. Some world leaders backed the military government, such as those from Chile and Argentina. The Chilean government trained and advised Salvadoran forces, while Argentina supported the SF as part of Operation Charlie. By 1989, the FMLN's attacks demonstrated that the conflict was at an impasse. Neither side had a strategic advantage. Global events withdrew foreign support from both. The collapse of the Soviet Union deprived the FMLN of allies, and the end of the Cold War shifted U.S. politics. There was no longer interest in supporting counterinsurgency efforts in El Salvador. The U.S. pushed for a peace agreement due to the high number of deaths. Meanwhile, about 80,000 soldiers and civilians in El Salvador perished in this war. Half of the country fled to the U.S., especially to Los Angeles and California. Despite the end of the conflict, violence persisted in El Salvador. Many refugees in Los Angeles became involved in gangs. The war on drugs and anti-immigration policies became popular in the U.S., leading to the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, which mandated the deportation of criminal immigrants after their sentences. Surprisingly, gang members were not experienced criminals. They were young Salvadorans. Displaced families forced victims to fend for themselves. Reasons for joining gangs included familial neglect and the normalization of violence. They found safety and belonging, but lost their freedom to gangs like 18th Street and MS-13. These gangs, while similar, have distinct rivalries. El Salvador has the 3rd highest feminicide rate globally. In 2016, 1 in 5,000 women was killed, with only 5% of cases resulting in convictions. MS-13 members tattoo themselves, sometimes even on their faces, with the group's symbols. In the early 2000s, they stopped tattooing their faces to avoid being identified during crimes. MS members, like many gangs in the U.S., use hand signs for communication and identification. A common sign is the devil's head, forming an inverted M. If you're into heavy metal, this might sound familiar. What might interest you more is that some members were hired by the Sinaloa cartel to fight against Los Zetas in the drug war in Mexico. The FBI and U.S. immigration monitored their activities and launched operations against them, arresting many. Did this stop them? They grew stronger. In 2004, the FBI created the MS-13 National Gang Task Force to collaborate with local and state agencies aimed at dismantling the gang. They attempted to deport members, but when that failed, they worked with authorities in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico. This strategy led to numerous arrests and crackdowns in 5 countries, involving over 6,000 police officers. In the U.S., 73 suspects were arrested, and more than 650 MS-13 members were detained. However, the more they were arrested, the more violent they became, until one man emerged. President Bukele's strategy to end gang violence was built on the pre-existing strategies of other Salvadoran presidents, most notably Antonio Saca. In June 2004, President Saca implemented the Super Mano Dura policy, which granted the Salvadoran army the authority to patrol gang-controlled areas, conduct random searches of suspected gang members, and arrest individuals based solely on their appearance. As a result of this policy, approximately 4,000 gang members were arrested, leading to overcrowding in El Salvador's prisons. In 2012, these gangs sought a truce. In March 2012, the MS-13 and 18th Street gangs established a truce in collaboration with the Salvadoran government. This truce faced criticism because it seemed the government was ceding sovereignty to these gangs. However, even if that was the case, it had a positive impact. At the beginning of 2012, there was an average of 16 homicides per day in El Salvador, but by the end of March, that number dropped to fewer than 5 per day. On April 14, 2012, for the first time in more than 3 years, there were no murders in the country. Overall, there were about 411 recorded murders in January 2012, but in March, the number was only 188. This represents a 50% reduction, showing that the truce was indeed effective. However, it did not take long for it to collapse, and violence returned to plague the streets. By 2015, there were approximately 60,000 gang members in El Salvador, and 70% of the country's businesses were being extorted, leading to annual losses in the billions of dollars. According to estimates from the Central Reserve Bank of El Salvador, the homicide rate was at its peak, even higher than during the Civil War. If you research further, you will find that the violence originated from the struggle for land ownership in the 18th century in El Salvador, which then escalated into political violence involving left and right-wing parties, eventually giving rise to the MS-13 and 18th Street gangs, which were engaged in a racial war in the U.S. with African-American gangs. But how exactly did Bukele manage to interrupt this centuries-old cycle of violence? On June 1, 2019, Nayib Bukele was elected president of El Salvador. He became the youngest leader in Latin America and represented a new beginning for the country. His first step against gangs was to negotiate a peace treaty, according to the local newspaper El Faro. However, a week later, Bukele announced a money laundering investigation against the newspaper. Since then, he has targeted El Faro, forcing some journalists into exile. Others have left the country temporarily after publishing reports. Internationally, El Faro is well regarded. But in El Salvador, Bukele's campaign has been effective in making many view the newspaper as partisan and untrustworthy. Furthermore, the National Assembly approved a law to restrict media coverage of gangs. Journalists can face up to 10 years in prison for reproducing information from sources linked to gangs or that could cause public panic. Why did Bukele do this? To implement his plans to reduce gang violence. Under strict laws, security forces have swiftly targeted gangs, arresting suspects without warrants or evidence, streamlining the process compared to previous operations. El Salvador saw 33,000 arrests in the first few months. The state of emergency suspended constitutional rights, allowing for indefinite detentions based on vague charges, without warrants or evidence. Detainees have been denied judicial hearings within 72 hours, and lawyers are unable to communicate with them. Arrests are based on unverified intelligence and rumors. Bukele approved laws to keep gang members incarcerated for longer periods. Sentences have increased, and house arrest is no longer an option. But how effective has this been? Areas previously dominated by gangs are now free from them. Few see traces of their presence, and released members have less power. Before the state of crisis, gangs extorted money from people in small and medium-sized businesses, such as vendors, shopkeepers, local drivers, and taxi drivers. But that is now in the past. A bus company owner, who previously paid $6,000 a month in extortion fees, stopped immediately following the crackdown. The police reported a 54% decrease in extortion complaints between 2022 and September 2022. While concerning, this approach has proven to be the most effective in El Salvador. The question remains, will other countries follow this path in combating gang violence? To simplify, most governments abroad have never agreed to impose the types of policies that Bukele implemented. This is simply not constitutional, And here's something that no one really talks about. While the impact of the crackdowns in El Salvador has been transformative, the gangs are not finished. In fact, data from the Bukele administration itself contradicts the narrative that gangs have been completely defeated. In October 2023, the El administration claimed to have arrested 52,541 MS-13 members, 13,683 members of Barrio 18 Sureños, and 10,741 miembros de Barrio 18 Revolucionarios. However, these numbers have been inflated. According to official records from the Salvadoran police, more than half of those detained under the state of emergency are not full-fledged gang members. Specifically, there were around 32,331 arrests of gang members, 41,733 arrests of suspected collaborators, and 3,435 individuals under investigation, while at least 36% of gang members and collaborators, over 42,000 individuals, remain free. So, could Bukele's strategy work for other countries? Well, if other countries try to replicate what he did, they will likely only reproduce the dark side of El Salvador's model, and not its achievements. Governments could find themselves engulfed in chaos as criminal groups multiply in number, or retaliate with significant firepower. In this process, they could potentially reduce the space for civil society, government transparency, and pile a lot of detainees into already overcrowded prisons. Historically, presidents in Latin America who have not fully committed to democracy have been eager to adopt some or all of these measures for political gain anyway. So, perhaps the fight against crime serves as the perfect excuse. Despite all the success in reducing crime, Bukele's model comes at a steep cost. If these leaders and presidents are willing to bear this cost, it could truly change everything.